Hi, welcome back to Random Reading Pathways. I'm Matt, and I finished the Licanius fantasy trilogy by James Islington, and a central concept that really weaved its way through basically the entire trilogy, but most notably the final installment, which was The Light of All That Falls, was the idea of fate and the idea of predetermination of certain actions and certain events in the main characters' lives. And I'm pretty fascinated with that topic in general. I always enjoy when a work kind of tackles that idea, whether it's a fantasy work or otherwise. And speaking of otherwise, another pretty recent read for me that I've mentioned before, and I did highlight as my favorite nonfiction book I read in 2024, is Determined by Robert Sapolsky. And never really got a chance to circle back to that book and talk about it a little bit more on its own, but I did think that I should kind of tie these two books together because they're two pretty recent reads for me, one being the end of last year and one being just 2 days ago that I finished, both sort of offering their own takes on the idea of free will and the lack thereof. So what I would basically say is, it was interesting to think about the idea of free will and the idea of fate and how those two kind of clash against each other. From two wildly different lenses. One being from Sapolsky's point of view as a neuroscientist and really looking at the lack of free will, at least in his opinion, from more of the standpoint of what's going on in our brains on a second-to-second and microsecond-to-microsecond basis, and even minute-to-minute and day-to-day, and how our brains have evolved over millions of years. To basically get us to the point where we act in a certain way. Whereas contrasting that with the Licanius trilogy, obviously being an epic fantasy series and taking place in a realm and a world that has no connection whatsoever to earthly rules and earthly dynamics, there you're looking at it more from I would say, divine sort of perspective. A lot of the important characters in the Licanius trilogy are actually divine in some sense. They're sort of godlike figures. So, there's Islington's series obviously tackles a somewhat related issue, I think, but does it from more of a sort of a cosmic fate perspective, and whether some creator or some divinity has essentially laid out all the events that will take place for all time. And humans or characters in that story are essentially just pieces playing their respective roles in that preordained, essentially, framework that's been created. I thought it was kind of cool to have two books recently sort of take those two different tacks on this issue. And I did want to specifically highlight this theme in these two books, especially since, I was brought to the Licanius trilogy randomly. I went to my library and decided I wanted to start reading a new fantasy series, and I rolled the random number generator in that section of the library, and it took me to Licanius book 1, which was The Shadow of What Was Lost, and I enjoyed that first book enough to go ahead and continue the series, so I'm happy to say I completed it now. I think the big thing I would highlight in book 3, The Light of All That Falls, is sort of something that was building throughout the series, and it was built to sort of like a pre-climax, I would say, in book 2, with a sort of a cliffhanger toward the end where basically the idea is really hammered home that there's an event that's going to take place in this universe involving one of the main characters that is unavoidable. It is fated. And it just so happens that the characters in the Licanius trilogy, they often, so in other words, instead of us, regular everyday people saying, "Oh God," or "Oh my God," or something to that effect, what they say is fates. So a lot of times if they exclaim something or they have sort of a exclamation of surprise, they'll say fates. So it's all about fate. And certainly the cliffhanger that I mentioned, sort of carrying itself over from book 2 to book 3, was great in the sense that it was strong enough of a cliffhanger, and it was important enough to one of the characters that you spend most of book 3, The Light of All That Falls, sort of a little bit on edge and a little bit on the edge of your seat, waiting for this preordained event to take place, since in the structure of the book as it's laid out, again, everything is already determined. But since it's an event involving one of the main characters, at the same time, you're also in your head as a reader thinking, well, the book is telling me very specifically and many times that this event is going to take place. But I've read enough books at this point to know that that's a setup, right? There's got to be some way out of this. There's got to be some twist and some reason why what's being described to me as a preordained fatalistic event actually may not happen. So it's great. It's a great setup for the third book because you're, again, like I said, not to repeat myself, but you are being told with no reservation that this event's going to happen, and it already has been determined by the gods, essentially. But at the same time, you're waiting to figure out why it won't happen, and if it won't happen. And that's kind of the take on free will that I enjoyed in Licanius, was knowing and getting clues from the author and from the characters, certain things that are already written in stone, essentially, and already foreseen or foresaw by the augur characters, who are a powerful race within this group of people that is able to look ahead and see events of the future. So again, fate and determinism are at play in Licanius from more of a grand scale idea, and you're led to believe you're following a series of historical events that are basically like reading history in real time. It's already known what's happening, and you're just watching it. Now, to go back to determined, I thought that, as I said earlier, is a different take on a lack of free will. And, make no mistake, Sapolsky does argue and make it his point to state that there is no free will, but not from a divine standpoint, or not from a fate standpoint, or that the universe has a plan. He's not saying God has determined everything that's happening already. In fact, he goes into some detail and discusses at length his atheism, and actually uses the idea of his atheism, not just his, but atheism in general, to sort of prop that up against the idea of having no free will, and saying, in other words, well, if I'm saying there's no free will, then aren't atheists, going to just run amok, I think is the term that he uses. And he goes into an explanation of why you don't see atheists out on the streets running amok and causing mass chaos, because there is no free will and there's no higher power preordaining everything. So, why wouldn't they be doing that? So he talks about that. But really, what he focuses in on is he drills right into the cranium. He drills right into the formula of humanity by way of its brain and its brain evolution, and why our brains develop in the way they do. And our brains are really all we are, right? So at the end of the day, what animates us, what causes us to do everything that we do, say everything that we say, all originates from the firings of our brain. If that wasn't happening, we don't simply do anything. We don't live. So, and I think he makes a pretty convincing argument. And to me, I was sort of going along for the ride, and, be interested to see how he was going to tie it all up. And for a few hundred pages, it was fascinating to read, but I wasn't sort of getting a definitive takeaway. And then at some point, it kind of clicked. And if I had to say like a takeaway, a definitive sort of one-sentence summary of what I think the argument is, and when this clicked for me, it was it sort of hit home. It was sort of convincing to me. And I think what Sapolsky's saying, in my own words, certainly not his words, but I think what he's saying when he says there's no free will is there's no free will in the sense of many thousands of years of evolution and development of humanity in general and my own personal ancestors have taken place in a way that is both beyond my control completely, outside of any realm of my participation, and yet has unfolded in a way, a very, very specific, complex way that has made me become the kind of person that I am, and therefore I am the kind of person that acts in the way that I do. So he anticipates all the counter arguments, like the classic counter argument of, well, how can you say there's no free will if, let me decide to just tap my head right now. You couldn't have predicted I was going to do that. Or, in the middle of a very formal business meeting, what if I were to jump up and down on the table and start making monkey noises? You can't say there's no free will if I go ahead and do that completely out of the blue. It was my choice to do that. But what Sapolsky's saying, I think, is, okay, that's point well taken, but the counter-argument is, no, the same idea that I said earlier explains all of that. For some reason, a person choosing to take that silly kind of action to show there is free will, that person and that person's brain were formed in a very specific way based on millennia of factors that all confluenced together to create the makeup of that unique specific person. And that person's specific makeup, which was created by all those factors beyond his control or knowledge, converged in a way to make him the kind of person who would do that action. So that's kind of my takeaway from the book. Again, I was supposed to be a one-sentence summary. That was a few more than that. But basically, to boil it down, I think what Sapolsky's saying, and what really hit with me, what determined why, which was why I enjoyed it, if I was left, if I left that book and I was left hanging sort of without any kind of takeaway, I don't think it would have been a great feeling, but I'm happy that at some point this idea clicked in me, which is, again, to try to sum it up. We are all individual, very unique brains, essentially, that are sculpted in unique ways by things out of our control. And those brains animate our every single function, our every single decision, whether it's to lift up my hand right now, whether it's to move my hand like this. We have brains that make us do those actions, and the way those brains have been formed are completely out of our control. And therefore our actions, while they feel like they're in our control, on a evolutionary standpoint and a large scale standpoint, they're sort of not. So there you go. 2 recent reads on free will, fate, determinism. One in an epic fantasy saga, which I'd recommend, definitely. I think it ended very well with A Light of All That Falls. And now I can finally sum up my reading time required for the Licanius trilogy. So if anyone remembers from a prior video, I think I said The Shadow of What Was Lost. It took me 1 library borrowing period plus 2 renewals to finish that one. The second book, An Echo of Things to Come, it took me the standard library period plus 1 renewal. And then this final book, The Light of All That Falls, it took me 1 standard library borrowing period. So I read it a lot quicker than the other 2 books, although it was the longest book in the series at 850 pages about. But I got through it quicker, and to me that's always the easiest surefire sign that I enjoyed the book. So yeah, I did enjoy Determined. Obviously, I've spoken about that before, and I'm really happy I finished the Licanius trilogy. I can now say that I definitely enjoy James Islington as a fantasy writer, and I know that The Will of the Many, which is book 1 in his Hierarchy series, I know that that's his more recent book, and his other, his big major fantasy book that's out on the market right now. So given the Licanius trilogy and how I felt about it, and some of the themes I enjoyed its take on, The Will of the Many is on my TBR, and so at some point I'll be looking into that. But yeah, this is just one where I like to time check in on some reads that I feel have some commonalities between them, some themes that they share. And these are just so widely divergent books, these two, from such different authors with different backgrounds, and yet it made me think of the idea of fate and the idea of free will in two different ways, which I enjoyed. So that's it on these two books for now. I'll be moving away from the Licanius trilogy now after a long time spent with it, and I'll be back soon with some more updates on that. Thanks a lot.